Well, good morning. On behalf of the Brazil Institute, the Latin American program of the Woodrow Wilson Center, I would like to welcome you all this morning to learn and discuss with us the findings of a very, very interesting work done by an organization that I respect immensely, and as a journalist as a correspondent in my previous incarnation, have really benefited from their work, the Pew Center for the People and the Press. I was just talking to Richard how much I love this name as a journalist, and I would like to, we are going to have a presentation by our colleagues from Pew on a public opinion in Brazil, findings about the latest research of the Center on their Global Attitudes project. I would like to start by thanking two people that have helped us to bring this to us. Bruce Stokes, that just arrived, and Vidya also for helping us organize this. Was very, very important to have this precisely at this moment. As you know, Brazil will choose a new president in about less than 2 weeks, so we thought that this would be very useful to present here. We will hear from two speakers from Pew, Richard Wyke, Associate Director from the Pew Global Attitudes Project, and Juliana Horowitz, Senior Researcher for the same project. And then we have the pleasure to have with us also my dear friend Ricardo Mendes, who is Executive Director of Prospectiva Consulting, a firm that has also done polling in Brazil, has worked with us in many initiatives, including one that we had for a couple of years on innovation policies in Brazil. And I will offer also some comments about, the report, the findings, and particularly I think the messages that are in this report to the Brazilian leadership in business, in politics, etc. So with that, I think that I would like to invite Richard to present, and you can come here or you can do it from there, wherever. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Paulo, and thanks for hosting us today. And thanks to all of you for being here and giving us a chance to talk a little bit about our findings in Brazil. First, let me just tell you briefly a little bit of background about the Pew Global Attitudes Project. As many of you may know, what we do is essentially we conduct survey research around the world. We've, since 2002, interviewed over 240,000 people in 57 different countries, and we look at a lot of different topics. What we're probably best known for is looking at how America is perceived around the world, but we look at a lot of other things as well, views about globalization, democracy, terrorism, how people rate conditions in their countries and in their own lives. And what we want to do today is talk to you a little bit about a survey that we conducted this spring in 22 different countries, including, as you can see, Brazil. And of course, today what we're mostly going to focus on is our findings from Brazil, although occasionally we're going to show you some data from these other countries as well to put Brazil in a little bit of a comparative context. Now, in Brazil, we interviewed 1,000 people, and this is a nationally representative sample. And it's actually the first time we've had a nationally representative sample in Brazil, and it's the first time we've done a report like this where we've really looked in depth at Brazilian public opinion. And I hope it's the kind of thing that we can do more of in the future. So what we want to do today is Juliana and I want to cover basically 3 sets of findings. First of all, we'll look at domestic issues. How do Brazilians view national conditions? How do they view the economic situation in their country? What kind of ratings does Lula get? How do they feel about various key national institutions? Then we'll look at international issues, including things like how Brazilians perceive their country's role in world affairs, how they view both China and the U.S., and how they view a variety of international leaders. And then we'll also touch on some other topics as well, namely gender and the environment. And overall, I think what you'll see is a picture of Brazilian public opinion that says Brazilians are feeling pretty good about how things are going in their country, especially when you compare Brazilians to the rest of the world. And you also see, I think, that Brazilians are increasingly confident and feel good about their role in world affairs as well. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll turn it over to Juliana, who's going to tell you a little bit about public opinion on domestic issues. There you go.
Thanks. So as Richard mentioned, this is the first time that we did a report that focuses specifically on Brazil, and we thought this was the right time to do it as Lula prepares to leave office, and a lot has happened in Brazil over the past 8 years. And so one of the things that we wanted to establish was the national mood as Brazilians prepare to elect a new president. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a couple of slides that compare Brazil to other countries. But I wanted to give you a summary to give you a sense that Brazilians are very upbeat and are feeling very positive about where their country stands right now, particularly in terms of the economy. So we asked people around the world what they thought about their government's job in dealing with the economy. And out of 22 countries, Brazilians had the third most positive views of how their government is handling the economy, as well as optimism that the economy will be even better in the future. And we also asked about the current national economic conditions and satisfaction with the overall state of the nation, which I will talk about a little more. So when we asked Brazilians whether they were satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things were going overall, Brazilians were split. So looking at only Brazil, you get a picture that is not necessarily positive or negative. 50% were satisfied and 49% dissatisfied. But one advantage that we have in our project is that we're conducting surveys internationally, and so we can have a cross-national context. And at a time when much of the world is just getting out of a recession and publics around the world are feeling very negatively about their own countries, you can see that at 50%, Brazilians are the second most positive, as is the case with a lot of our questions. Only in China is there more satisfaction and more positive feelings. I wanted to point out specifically the two other Latin American countries that we surveyed, as well as the United States, so you can get an idea of just how positive that 50% is. If you look at Argentina, 3/4 of Argentinians are dissatisfied with the state of their nation. Even more Mexicans are dissatisfied. And in the U.S., also a very large majority, 62%, are unhappy with the way things are going in their country. We also asked about current economic conditions, and there Brazilians are clearly satisfied. A majority of Brazilians say the current economic situation in Brazil is good. Again, China stands out as the only country where people are more positive than in Brazil. And if you look in most of the countries that we surveyed, a majority is actually feeling has very, very negative opinions about the economy in their country. That is not the case in Brazil. Again, Brazilians give their government a very positive rating for the way it's dealing with the economy. And even the people who think the economy is in bad shape, a majority of those people say that the government's doing a good job. And so even to the extent that they think the economy is bad, they still think that the government is trying and doing what it can do to make it better. Brazilians also feel very positive about certain groups and institutions. We also asked about the president, and Lula is extremely popular in Brazil, and 84% of Brazilians said the president had a good influence on the way things were going in the country. And the national government also got very good ratings. But other organizations and institutions, the media, large foreign companies, religious leaders, the military, got very positive ratings. The police, on the other hand, got much more negative ratings than the other groups and institutions that we tested. A very slim majority of Brazilians said the police were having a good influence on the way things were going in the country. And for most of these, the views were especially positive among people in rural areas and people with lower income levels and lower education levels. And that was especially the case on views about the police. Brazilians in higher income groups had very negative views about the police and how it's influencing the country as a whole. whereas people in the lower income groups and lower education groups actually felt quite positively about the police and about some of these other groups. We asked about the Bolsa Familia program, which, as many of you know, is the flagship program of the Lula administration domestically. And again, this is an incredibly popular program. Just as Lula gets good ratings, this program is seen as a good thing for Brazil by 81% of Brazilians. Even among people who don't think that Lula has an overall positive influence on Brazil, a majority think that the Bolsa program has been a good thing. And as you can see, there are some income differences and some education differences, and so the people in the lower income groups who are the most likely to be receiving the Bolsa Familia, 90% think it's a good thing compared to 65% in the high income group. So there is a difference there across income groups, but still a majority of people, even in the high income group and in the high education group, think that Bolsa Familia has been a good thing for the country. But still, despite the overall positive mood in Brazil, Brazilians still see a lot of problems facing their country today. Specifically, illegal drugs, crime, and corruption stand out as being rated at the top of what Brazilians see as very big problems in Brazil. As you may know, political corruption has been a big issue in this campaign and something that's been talked about a lot. And 79% of Brazilians said that corrupt political leaders is a very big problem in their country. But also social inequality, pollution, infectious diseases, and to a lesser extent, economic problems. And the one issue that we tested that didn't register as much of a challenge in Brazil was access to drinking water. Only 27% said that was a very big problem in Brazil. And for these, we didn't see a lot of demographic differences, but people in rural areas were somewhat more likely than people in urban areas to see these things as very big problems. But one of the most interesting demographic differences that we found with this series was on social inequality. And there, we saw a big difference between among racial groups. And so 77% of Brazilians who self-identify as being black said that social inequality was a very big problem, compared with 68% of those who said they were of mixed race and 63% of those who said they were white. But we didn't see a difference across income groups or educational groups when it came to social inequality that we saw with the racial groups. And then we also had a series of questions on gender, which we asked around the world. And as is the case in most of the countries that we surveyed, Brazilians overwhelmingly embraced gender equality, but Brazilians also in some cases stood out, and in some cases were similar to the rest of the world in saying that there's still a lot of gender inequality in their country, and there's still a lot of work to be done to get to the point where women have the same rights as men. And then one of the questions where you can see is we asked who has a better life in your country, men or women. And in Brazil, 42% said that men had a better life. And there was a big gender gap there with especially women saying that men have a better life. And so, this being an election in Brazil where Brazil is probably going to elect its first female president, it looks like that's what's going to happen. And so we asked, putting aside your feelings about Dilma Rousseff, do you think it would be a good thing or a bad thing for the country to have a female president, or does it not make a difference? And 70% of Brazilians said that they thought it would be a good thing for a female to be elected president. Only 13% said bad, and 15% said the gender doesn't matter. So we wanted to show you, for comparison, results from the United States in 2007. This is October of 2007, and this is a Pew Research Center poll that asked people to put aside their views about Hillary Clinton and whether it was exactly the same question. And here the results were very different. Only 33% of Americans said that it would be a good thing to have a female president, 9% said bad, and a majority of Americans said that the gender of the president doesn't matter. And another interesting thing about these results is that Brazilian men and women had pretty much the same views. It was 71% of women, 70% of men said that it would be a good thing to elect a female president, whereas when we did this poll in the United States, 42% of women said it would be good, and only 24% of men said it would be good. Very few men said it would be a bad thing, but men tended to be more in the category of the gender of the president doesn't matter. And of course, here it's important to point out that when we conducted our poll, Dilma was still not somebody who was very well known. And so maybe it was easier for people to put aside their feelings about her, whereas, of course, Hillary Clinton was somebody who was already established and at that point the likely front runner. And so, of course, we have to pay attention to the context here. But still, we thought that this was a very interesting comparison of where people stood on this issue. And at that, I'm going to give it back to Richard, who will tell you about Brazil's place in the world.
Thanks. Well, as we mentioned, there are a number of questions on the survey that deal with international issues, including some questions that are designed to get at how Brazilians view their country's role on the world stage. Certainly in the press and in policymaking circles over the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about Brazil as a rising power. So, what we want to see is, do average citizens, what do they think about this? Do average citizens in Brazil see their country as a rising power? And, I think what we found is that the answer is largely yes. 24% of Brazilians say that their country already is one of the world's leading powers. Another 53% say that Brazil eventually will be a world power. And only 20% say that their country is never going to be a world power. So on this question, I think you can see a lot of optimism and confidence about Brazil's role in international affairs. Brazilians also think they have a pretty popular country. This is a question we asked in 22 countries around the world. Do you think your country is generally liked or disliked by people in other countries? And as you can see here, 8 in 10 Brazilians say that they think their country is generally liked by others, which puts them pretty close to the top of the list here. Now, it's true that in most countries, most people think their country is generally popular, although there's some exceptions. If you can see down near the bottom of the list here, you will finally see the United States. Only 35% of Americans, by comparison, say that their country is popular abroad. The U.S. is actually getting more popular than it used to be. People need to read up on their Pew Global Attitudes Project reports, and they would find out that we're actually doing better now. But Americans really aren't convinced yet that their country is popular internationally. We also asked Brazilians what they think of some major nations around the world, including the U.S. and China. And what we find is that the U.S. gets pretty good marks. 62% of Brazilians have a favorable view of the U.S., and only 29% have an unfavorable view of the U.S. So, generally positive marks for America. And on balance, positive marks for China as well. 52% have a favorable view of China. But in general, the U.S. does get slightly higher ratings than China among Brazilians. Then we also asked the same question in the other 2 Latin American countries that we surveyed, Argentina and Mexico. And both the U.S. and China get better marks in Brazil than they get in either Mexico or Argentina. And here's another question that we ask about Brazil's relationship with both the U.S. and with China. 56% of Brazilians say that the U.S. is a partner to their country. Only 11% say the U.S. is an enemy. 27% say it's neither a partner nor an enemy. Same question about China. 54% say it's a partner, 11% enemy. So here again, I think you see the same pattern. On balance, China gets positive marks, but it's not quite seen as positively as is the U.S. among Brazilians. Now, here's a question we ask about a variety of international leaders. Essentially, how much confidence do you have in that leader to do the right thing in world affairs? And when we ask this about Lula, again, he gets these very, very high ratings. 78% of Brazilians say they have confidence in Lula to do the right thing in world affairs. Only 21% lack confidence. So, again, Lula getting the kind of ratings that political leaders around the world would love to get. Obama generally gets positive marks too. 56% say they have confidence in President Obama. About a third say they lack confidence. The other international leaders that we tested didn't fare quite as well. You look at French President Sarkozy, German Chancellor Merkel, President Medvedev of Russia. They get more negative ratings than positive ratings among Brazilians. And then at the bottom of the list here, we have Hugo Chavez. It's hard to find many Brazilians who have a positive view of Chavez. Only 13% say they have confidence that he'll do the right thing in world affairs. 7 in 10 do not have confidence in him. Now, we asked these same questions in Mexico and Argentina, And Chavez also gets low ratings in both of those countries as well, and he gets considerably lower ratings than Lula gets in those countries. And I think that's a pattern we've seen over time when we've done survey work in Latin America. Not a lot of support for Chavez. Lula has generally gotten relatively positive marks in Latin America. Now, one of the issues that we wanted to ask about on this year's poll in Brazil and around the world is the issue of Iran's nuclear program. Obviously, this is something that President Lula has been very engaged in diplomatically over time. And what we find in Brazil is that, first of all, Brazilians do not want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. 85% say they oppose Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And what we did is we asked those people who say they oppose this, what do they want to do about it? And what we find is that 65% say that they are willing to consider tougher economic sanctions on Iran. And remember, this poll was conducted in the spring before the UN vote on sanctions. So this was actually conducted at a time when Lula was engaged in some pretty extensive diplomacy on this issue to put together a deal that would have averted economic sanctions. So this might be one example of a place where Lula was a little bit out of step with public opinion, although overall, of course, he gets very high marks on how he handles foreign policy. We also asked about a military option, and we see a big number of these folks who oppose Iran acquiring nuclear weapons also saying that they're willing to consider using military force to stop Iran from doing this. So a lot of support in Brazil for a pretty tough stance on Iran. I think this is pretty consistent with what we've seen in many other parts of the world, too, in this survey. One final issue that we wanted to show you some data on is the issue of global climate change, because this is one where Brazil really stands out. 85% of Brazilians say that global climate change is a very serious problem, which puts them at the top of this list. You do see a lot of variation across countries. Notably, if you look down here at China and the U.S., the two largest contributors of greenhouse gases in the world, there's much less concern about this issue. But Brazilians really stand out as being more concerned about it. And I think we see that on some other environmental questions as well. Brazilians saying that they're more concerned than most others around the world about the environment. So, the environment is one place where Brazil kind of stands out, and I think there are lots of others, as we've shown you some of here, some other issues in where Brazil really does stand out in some interesting ways on this survey. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Ricardo, would you like to offer your comments right now? You can come here. You can do it from there.
I'll do it from here.
Is that good? Can you get it?
Say something so we know whether we can hear you.
Yes, is it on? No? Okay. I think it's all now. Yep.
But go there. The mic is working.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Paulo Sotero for this invitation. We've been, our company, Prospectiva Consulting, and the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, the Brazilian program here. We've had this partnership for the last few years, and it's really a pleasure to be here commenting such an interesting study done by the Pew Center, the Pew Research Center. I was very interested. I thought this brought some of the results that appeared in the research in the polls were not that surprising. I think we were just talking out here. Brazilians are very pragmatic. When you look at the ratings they give to the economy, and when you look at the polls, at the election polls, it's not surprising Lula's candidate is doing so well. I think they're not really every other topic that you consider becomes small when you look at economic growth and their perception of purchasing power increasing and this kind of thing. So I think this was the first result that grabbed my attention, and I think it really shows how much confidence Brazilians have in this government and how much confidence they have in Lula's successor. So this was the first point that I would like to highlight. I think the other point that I thought it was quite interesting was regarding foreign policy. And one interesting point is that Brazilians are raised believing that Brazil is a country of the future, and that has been happening for generations. It's not a new thing. People for generations and generations believe that Brazil is a country of the future because of the natural resources we have, because of the size of the country, because of the people, the variety of the population we have there. And it's considering these changes that are happening in Brazil now, all the economic growth and this international projection of Brazil, significant part of Brazil still believe that Brazil will be a leader of the world. It's not a leader yet, but it will be. I wonder what this would look like if you asked 5 or 10 years ago what kind of results we would have for this. Probably a lot more people would be saying Brazil will be someday a country of the future, but now we see more people saying that Brazil is already playing an important role in global affairs. So this is also an interesting thing that I would like to highlight. On gender issues, when asked about the whether it would matter or not to have a female president elected, this is very interesting because I hadn't even thought about that. This is not part of the public debate in Brazil. Dilma Rousseff being a woman, how much that's going to be different from having, as being the first Brazilian woman elected. This is not part of the debate. I haven't seen this being debated in public opinion at all. So it was interesting to see the results as well. Okay. I think one point that also grabbed my attention was, I think reading the report, you see people giving a lot of support to the president's economic policies. And as you know, especially during Lula's second mandate, Brazil has been pursuing a state-led model of economic growth. And this is when people were asked about their opinion about free markets, and I was quite surprised to see how much support there is to free markets when you consider that the economic model being pursued by Brazil is actually a state-led model, and you don't see discussions of reducing taxes or signing free trade agreements with other countries. So I think this is it comes to one of the conclusions I have, which is, it has been broadly debated, which is a clear contradiction between foreign policy and the public opinion in Brazil. I mean, foreign policy in general incorporates very little of what public opinions are actually defending, and you can see that in the when it comes to free trade agreements. You can see that on the perceptions that Brazilians have on the United States, and you can see that on the perceptions that Brazilians have on Iran's nuclear program, and you can also see that on the perception that Brazilians have on Hugo Chavez, for instance. You see contradictions in the foreign policies that Brazil is pursuing all of these issues. So. And also, in another point that I also saw a clear contradiction with what Brazilian foreign policy is pursuing is climate change. Okay? As you know, Brazil has an ambiguous position on climate change. Climate change is not part of Dilma Rousseff's political platform. And we see a lot of Brazilians concerned about this. Brazilians, of all the countries that are here, Brazilians are the ones that consider the problem to be, compared to other people, they are the ones that consider the problem to be bigger. So that also grabbed my attention. That was a clear contradiction between domestic policy and foreign, between public opinion and foreign policy on that matter. Okay? And finally, I think there are other issues that I thought it was quite interesting that I would like to see more. Illegal drugs being a major problem, I think that's cuts across all social classes. The police not being considered a very good institution in Brazil. I would like to see some, in terms of the regional differences. I think the police is not a federal entity in Brazil. They are state institutions, and the police would get different ratings in different states. So it would also be interesting to see how that would differ in different states. And there was the one topic that I would like to see compared to other countries as well, that maybe if you have the opportunity of conducting this a similar research in the future, would be Brazilian opinion on education. I think education is a central issue in Brazil right now, especially when we talk about economic growth. We have the most serious bottleneck for economic growth is not infrastructure, but education. And I will be very interested in learning how Brazilians perceive this problem and how other countries perceive this problem as well. Okay. And I think the last point that I would like to highlight is how Brazilian, and that was quite an interesting thing that it was indicated in the study, is how Brazilians perceive themselves as being positive in terms of foreign policy. I think this is also a very sensitive thing for Brazilians, is to be criticized internationally. I think Brazilians are always trying to have this good image abroad. Brazilians are very concerned about that. Not only public opinion are concerned about that, but the foreign policy makers are also concerned about that. And surprisingly, Brazilians believe that they have a very positive image abroad. Okay? It's a traditional thinking in Brazil to believe that Brazil is a country of samba, of soccer, and these are all positive things. So this was quite an interesting thing as well. I wonder what this will look like. Brazil, with the international projection of Brazil, Brazil is likely to play a different role in international affairs, and not everything will be as positive as Brazilians would like to project. So I wonder what this will look like in a few years from now. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. I would like also to add my comments to this. I think this is absolutely fascinating. You know, what a bunch of pragmatic people we are, and you know, we are not even as machistas as we thought we were. So this is, the figure actually that Ricardo was mentioning about support for trade and the free market economy, it's quite amazing. 87%, is that 87? Yeah, 87.
I think it is.
Let me get I need this to see. Yeah, I believe that 87% think it's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a growing trade and business, and 75% agree that most better off in a free market economy. So it's quite surprising. One thing that Ricardo mentioned, you know, I learned this talking once with President Fernando Henrique Cardoso when he was a visiting fellow at the Library of Congress after leaving the presidency. This is the business of the country of the future, which in Brazil we turned into a joke, etc. There is no joke about that. And in the context of this, and that's what the president told me at St. Paulo, and then he compared with the United States and said, you know, there are only two countries in the world that define their own identity by a sense of what they will become. It is Brazil and the United States. Right now, the United States is sort of in a difficult moment, but you go to conventions, political conventions, big moments, it's very common to hear an American politician say, our better days are still ahead of us. That notion that you are in the process of improving. And Brazil, and the idea of the country of the future is actually a very positive idea. It's no joke. And I think that as Brazil starts to sort of see itself and be seen by others as a country occupying a bigger space, I think that becomes very important. One thing that I would like to see in a future poll, I don't know if you plan to ask this here and in all the 20-plus countries where you poll, is about, I don't know how to do this, and you are experts, but the costs of leadership. Because we in Brazil like to be seen as, but especially in our region, for instance, it's very interesting that President Cardoso, I think, risked a little bit more in trying to be a mediator in conflicts in our region. The current government was a little bit more shy on that. And we see ourselves rising. We see ourselves as the emerging power that rises in the area where the big hegemon used to be the big guy. But we hesitate in asserting leadership, in paying the costs of leadership. And this is going to continue because Brazil is now 60% of South America's GDP. Was 40% 30 years ago. And this difference, this asymmetry, will only grow. So the demands on Brazil from the region, in a region that we basically until recently had ignored, there is really, now the drivers are obviously Brazilian companies. Part of this liking of the world, the global economy, of the free market, is that now Brazil is a country of multinational companies that are abroad. So we are integrated also in that sense, not only because there are multinational companies in Brazil from other countries. So we are in this. So I find this question very interesting. Going back to one of the internal issues, when you see Lula's popularity, and just under that, which I really absolutely love as a journalist, the media in Brazil is very highly rated. Actually, President Lula this week attacked the media because of all the scandals that are going on. And he frontally attacked the media and saying, in the election we will prove that you are wrong, and sort of really trying to intimidate the media. And the media immediately responded in kind and say that don't even dream about intimidating us. We are going to stay on the case here. And I find this very healthy for democracy. And I find it very interesting that the same people that rates the president very high rates the media very high. I find this really, as a person that for 38 years was a practicing journalist, it gives me a sense of sort of pride that I think we have achieved that in Brazil with all the problems that media has and all the the faux pas that journalists make. The other thing that is associated with the Chavez, there is a question here that I really like also, is that they asked, who do you blame for Brazil's problems? Mm-hmm. And I find this absolutely great. The percentage of Brazilians that blame others for our problems is 5%. Mm-hmm. I find this really a very good indication of a country that is kind of, is sort of mature. We know, actually, we have this joke in Brazil, we are perfectly capable of creating all of our problems, so we don't blame others for that. So it is, and this is obvious a question that you understand why Chavez is so unpopular in Brazil. Because a Chavez guy in Brazil would not have a chance to start blaming problems that Brazil has into others. And from time to time, politicians try to do that. There is, you cannot convince a Brazilian of that thing, of that argument. So it's, I find it fascinating. I would like to, I don't know if you guys have, Juliana, Richard, if you have any additional comments, or we could open this to a discussion. Yeah, can we open? Yes, sir. Let's go. Wait for the mic, because we want to get everything on tape here. Renata, on the other side, the gentleman here. Oh, you have one there? Mm-hmm. Good. Please just give us your name and affiliation.
Charles Martin, Florida Coastal School of Law. I have two questions. One methodological, I think related to what Mr. Menges was talking about. There's an old saying in Brazil, "Para inglês ver," loosely translated as "tell the powerful English speakers what they want to hear." Is that no longer an issue in surveying the Brazilian public? And the other question is related to education. Why were none of the countries apparently asked about satisfaction with their education systems, given that it can be a drag on development?
I think you turn it up. Did you see?
There's a little switch.
Okay, I see that. But, I mean, those are both good questions. If we work in all the countries where we work with local researchers who speak the right languages, know how to conduct this kind of research in that country. So all the interviews here were conducted in Portuguese by a local research organization who does this kind of work in Brazil. Regarding education, it's a very good question, and it's a topic I think we probably should look more at. We have looked at it in the past. Back in 2007, we did a major survey where we had people around the world rank issues in their country, things like crime, economic issues, environmental issues, and we asked about education then, and I think it was a big concern in many, many countries around the world, and I think we'll ask that question again, maybe next year or in the next couple of years.
Well, one thing that I wanted to add with, in regards to the methodology, one of the things that we make sure of is that the interviewers don't identify themselves as conducting the survey for an American organization for exactly that reason, so that people don't give the answers that they think an international audience would like to hear. And so as far as the respondent is concerned, this is being conducted for like a Brazilian research firm and not necessarily for an international group.
Yes, here.
I'm Ted Picone with the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much. This is fascinating work. I want to really focus on this contradiction question between public opinion on foreign policy issues and Lula's foreign policy. And I think most analysts expect there really won't be much change with the Dilma Rousseff foreign policy. So this contradiction may likely continue for some time. How do you explain it? I mean, and I want to go back to the slide you had about actors that have influence. You didn't have any note about NGOs or political parties, other international actors, and I'm wondering where they might fall, and what are the other key voices on Brazilian foreign policy? Who are the domestic actors or other actors that are driving or influencing foreign policy? Apparently very few, because it seems to be a very closed, elitist bubble that is driving foreign policy, and is that likely to continue? And then one related question is this, Paulo, your comment about Brazilians see themselves as the country of the future. Have any questions or any thoughts on what it means in a Brazilian's mind to be a world leader? What are the values behind that? What is it, does it mean a peacekeeping force in Haiti? Does it mean a peacekeeping force in other parts of the country, of the world, et cetera? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
You want to?
Yeah, just a quick comment before I answer your question, before I comment your question. I wouldn't say there is a contradiction between public opinion and Lula's foreign policy. I would say there is a contradiction between public opinion and Brazilian foreign policy as a whole. We didn't start with Lula's government. This is not a new thing. It's been on for a long time. And I think it has to do with the development model that Brazil adopted in the past, which was self-sufficiency and industrialization and self-inducted industrialization. I think it has to do with that. So in general, public opinion was, and you can see this in the political debates in Brazil, there's hardly ever a discussion on foreign policy. We were expecting foreign policy was going to be a major issue being on this current election, since the two main candidates had such different views on diplomatic priorities for Brazil. But even then, that's just not a priority. That's not something a public opinion demand from the candidates, from the politicians. So that's one of the reasons why foreign policy is still a very much bureaucratic. It's formulated within the cabinets of the foreign ministry and not part of a much broader public debate. There's a growing number of actors that play a role that actually influence the foreign policy making process in Brazil, and that includes the Brazilian multinational companies, that includes other areas in government. In the past, the foreign policy making process was very much driven by the foreign ministry itself, and now we see this as a part of a broader process in which other agencies from the government are also involved. Okay? From the executive branch I'm talking about. The legislative is still not as engaged in foreign policy as they should be, but you see more of that happening these days than you do in the past. There are some examples about that for instance, Venezuela's entry into Mercosur, there was a big issue in Congress. It was the administration really had to push it hard to have it approved by the Brazilian Congress. It was not an easy thing. So you see these things happening. You see NGOs. You see the academia. I think academia is playing a very important role in influencing foreign policy in Brazil. We don't have the think tank structure as you do here in the United States or in other countries also have. But that's starting to grow. I think even the international think tanks play an important role in Brazilian foreign policy. This is all starting to change, but it's still very much centered. And I think at the end of the day, the priorities are defined by the people who are in the ministry, and not. They don't even bring these questions to a broader debate.
And there are José Serra, the opposition candidate, has tried to make foreign policy, special regional policy, an issue, and there was no traction. Absolutely zero traction on that. On issues related to human rights, to drugs, etc., which is a very present and real problem in Brazil, because whatever comes from Colombia and Bolivia, etc., affects the lives of Brazilians, daily lives, with drugs and crime and gun availability of guns, etc., etc. So, no traction there. Now, I wanted to say something in response to your question, trying to do the more controversial aspects of the current foreign policy. They became so only in the last 2 years. They were not very evident before that. And I believe that the factor that made the opening was created, I believe, by the 2008 crisis in the United States. That's when, and I wrote an article that will be published very soon, and I deal a little bit with that. And I think that that is what gave a group of people that represent a certain view, a more ideological view in Brazil, and both right and left, but they are also in the government, gave the opening to force the issue, and there is a group in Brazil that see Brazil's rise vis-a-vis the United States as sort of a zero-sum game. In order for us to go up, the United States has to come down. We know from all evidence that the only country that could actually say that doesn't. It's China. We know that China's rise economically, Bruce probably knows this much better, knows this exactly. Bruce, China is what percentage of the world economy now? About 8 something, and it's projected to become like 15, 16 in 10 years. And most of this will come out of the US and Europe's share. Brazil's economy is about 2% of world GDP and will be 2.3%. It's not Brazil that's going to change it, but there is a group in Brazil that thinks that for us to rise, although there's no evidence that this is true, it's a pure ideology. And you can see that the country has a favorable view of the United States, wants to be integrated in a market economy. So it's a challenge for foreign policy makers in Brazil coming ahead. The issue of Iran, and I think it's a major issue coming. In 1988, when we adopted our new constitution, we decided to include a clause saying that we will never build on nuclear weapons. Not only that, we made that clause unamendable. You cannot change that. You have to change the whole thing in order to change that. There was not much of a debate in Brazil about that. We did that because the military that left power in '85 were doing a secret nuclear program. So we decided, no, they were doing that, so we are doing exactly the opposite. We are going not to do that, and we are going to promise forever that we are not going to do that. In '97, President Cardoso said, well, we have that, so why don't we sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty? And there was a small debate in Brazil about that, but it was not something that engaged the people, and we signed it. And more recently, we decided we are not going to sign the additional protocol, which I find it kind of contradictory, because if you have this, you have a clause, and you sign the NPT, why don't you do the other thing? So there is a major debate to be had in Brazil about, I think this will be one of the issues coming, our role in the region, our role in the world, our role in Africa, which I think is potentially a very positive one. But there is a study conducted by SEBRI, the Center for International Relations in Brazil. I don't know if you are familiar with what Amaury de Souza did, talking to what he called the foreign policy community in Brazil. And he asked some of those questions. It's a sample, it's a smaller sample of 400 people, but I think has some ideas, and more people are engaged in foreign policy. But yes, it will become a major issue, and now we have a difference. The last two presidents, Cardoso and Lula, were international figures, and special people, actually. Now we are going to go to the run-of-the-mill people. Brazilians, normal Brazilians, people like, us, and with this Brazil that is bigger in the world. How do we manage that? So now Brazil will have to run its own government, in a sense. The nation will have to, and this, to me, is one of the most important challenges going ahead. Questions? Yes, just you, sir. Yes, and then José Raul.
Dan Zarin, Climate and Land Use Alliance. With that affiliation, you can guess that I'm interested in Section 5 of this report on environmental issues. It's actually quite astounding the degree to which the Brazilian public is not only sympathetic, but fully embracing environmental issues, particularly climate change, relative to other populations globally. It's also reflected in the leadership that the Lula administration has shown, both domestically and internationally, on environmental issues, and particularly climate change. But nonetheless, it stands in contrast to very strong tendencies domestically within Brazil that are reflected politically, including most recently and currently in the Forest Code debates in the Brazilian Congress, that with the incoming Congress are likely to quite likely to lead to a dramatic reform in that policy, and to the programs advancing under the PAC. And I'm wondering how you see those contrasts working out moving forward under a leadership which is less visionary and more perhaps aligned with the more traditional developmentalist agenda of the Brazilian agro-industry in the state.
I just make a very quick comment on this. I think one of the most important facts about these elections is the emergence of a strong candidate from the Green Party. I think Marina Silva is bringing some new elements to the political debate in Brazil which reflect the priority that Brazilians give to climate change. I mean, she's not doing, I mean, as it was expected, she's not one of the favorite candidates to win the elections, although the ideas she brings to the debate are ideas that Brazilians actually want to see in the political debate. They're expecting this to be there, and it would be very, very interesting to follow how this is going to be incorporated in the next elections. And I agree there is a clear contradiction in some domestic policies, especially the PAC program, which is infrastructure without really considering the impacts that will have on the environment. And but I think at the same time that you see that happening, you see this other political force emerging as a very important new element in the Brazilian political debate. So let's see. And José Serra, for instance, he had to incorporate the ideas that were brought by Marina to differentiate himself from Dilma Rousseff, and that was. I see that as a positive thing. Okay.
One thing I wanted to just mention, one person here for whom I have enormous admiration, and was our ambassador here once, Rubens Recupero, who is one of the intellectuals of Itamaraty, one of the historians of Brazilian diplomacy. And he once said that, we are a soft power country, right? The only area where we can be a hard power country is the environment. And this is the only area where we have assets, where we could claim leadership based on environmental policies to our own advantage. We know, and now more and more people in Brazil, including in the agro sector, know that in order to keep Brazilian modern agricultural development, you have to protect the Amazon, because that governs the rain patterns and the other things that we know. Yes, there are contradictions, but here's the challenge for the country. São Paulo, influenced by the people from the sugarcane industry, see that São Paulo has now the beginnings of a carbon market developing. In São Paulo, you have to reduce emissions, and it's part of the state law now. And so I think we are, we are at the beginning of another period where, yes, Dilma Rousseff has been more connected to the desenvolvimentismo, to the sort of, some people have compared actually some of the proposals coming from her side to some of the proposals that came from the military era, sort of development at any cost. But now in Brazil, there is a organized environmental community. There is a public opinion much more aware of that. I think there is money to be made, basically, on being good citizens and being a good country, and that's the vehicle for probably one of the vehicles for Brazilian leadership in a very positive way. So it's a challenge, and we don't know how it's going to, to develop. José Raul. And then.
Thank you, Paulo. Sit on? Okay. Thank you, Paulo. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. I just have two questions related to an issue that we've discussed here at the Wilson Center repeatedly on Brazil and Latin America, whether Brazil is, how is it different or similar to Latin America? I have two concerns. One is, when you were mentioning attitudes about where the country is going and how things are moving along, Latin Americans are notoriously pessimists. Even right now, for example, we've seen columns of people saying, you know what, you people should start focusing on the fact that you are doing well and stop, being so problemologists, right? So focusing so much. Even your results actually show Brazil, 56% of people, or 50-some% of people, think the country is in the right direction or everything is going well, which for a country that has made such big news, it's actually low compared with China or any of the other countries. And so I don't know, how do you account for the pessimistic bias in this kind of, I mean, if there are only 3 countries in Latin America that you look at, of course, and this is a Global Attitudes project. So, but I just want you to speculate a little bit on perhaps what might be going on in terms of this interpretation from the point of view of Brazilians. And the second one is going back to the issue of the environment, which seems to be the more relevant contradiction here. Theories of political science for a long time have stayed, actually a competitor survey to yours has been the basis of theories that say that environmental preservation is traditionally a post-material value. That it's when countries, and not in terms of policies, but in terms of citizen attitudes, that when countries have solvable material needs, that when they reach a certain level, associated with a certain level of development, is when people, the normal citizen, takes the environment very seriously into their own daily lives. Your data for the whole world not only shows a mixed result, but actually throws the theory, flips it over, because it's the developed countries, except for China, of course, that tend to have the worst results in this regard. So what do you think is going on here? And not just in terms of Brazil, but in terms of the whole question applied globally. Thank you.
Well, on Latin America, you know, again, hopefully soon, you know, in the future, we'll do another survey with even more countries. We had 2007 47 countries, so we could look at more countries from each region. Just looking at the countries that we have, and of course, Argentina is the only other country in South America that we have in the survey. But in general, what we've seen over the years is that, I mean, Argentinians tend to be very negative on everything. You know, it's not just attitudes about their own country, but it's attitudes about the United States. Like, Argentinians tend to have some of the more negative views about the United States. You know, Brazilians in this survey are quite optimistic and quite positive, and that 50% saying the country is going in the right direction compared to the rest of the world was a quite positive result. You know, I think in 19 of the 22 majorities actually said that their countries were not doing as well, and but you know, so it's difficult to say in Latin America in general, as you pointed out, we don't have a lot of Latin American countries. You know, Brazil has done better than some of the other countries and has become more of a player internationally and more visible, and has, you know, weathered the economic crisis better than many other countries. And so I don't know that Brazilians being as positive as they are, and, you know, maybe Argentinians not being as positive necessarily reflects only a cultural tendency to be more pessimistic in some countries than others. But we do see in Argentina specifically that views tend to be more negative in general about a lot of different issues.
Yeah, I think when it comes to pessimism, the Eastern Europeans and the Turks and a few others could probably give Latin America a run for its money on sort of negative views. So we see some of it in Latin America, but you know, that tends to be a factor in other regions of the world as well. I mean, I think it's a very good question, interesting question about the post-materialism hypothesis. You know, I mean, it can vary a little bit depending on what question you ask. We ask another question that's in this report about whether you're willing to pay higher prices in order to deal with the environment, to deal with global climate change. And, you know, there Brazil doesn't really stand out in the way that it does on these other measures of concern. But in the past, we also, and you can see some support often within a country for that sort of post-materialism hypothesis. Often within a given country, you'll see, you know, more educated, higher income people voicing more concern for environmental issues. We did something a few years ago called a global middle class study, where basically, you know, people who are in what we might call the global middle class were a bit more concerned about environmental issues. So yeah, I'd say it varies a little bit. You know, we've seen some support for that idea, but it varies from country to country, and it depends on what measure you're looking at.
I'd like to just, you know, one suggestion, just listen to you, Richard and Juliana. Since and Bruce knows that because he's the person that enlisted me early on to the debates that led to the program. So I contribute some to the way you're trying to shape the questions, right? And maybe if there would be a way, as you move forward, to ask the countries about their neighbors, their attitudes about their immediate neighbors. And in Brazil, you will find something very interesting. As you know, it's a very controversial thing. As you know, we do not see ourselves as Latin Americans. We do not define it. It's an identity thing. We are Brazilians. And then don't never tell call a Brazilian a Hispanic, then you get into real trouble. But this is something that, as an emerging nation there, we have to face and to deal with. There is one of the difficulties I find for Brazilian diplomats and others to develop a Latin American policy is that there isn't much of yet, or there is only now a constituency for that forming in Brazil because of economic interests of companies. Because people, you know, as a journalist in the 70s, I was only the third person in the media in Brazil to specialize in Latin America. We didn't have that. We used to translate this, whatever the New York Times was publishing about Bolivia. And then we decided to go, hey, how about having our own view about a country with which we share our longest border? That is Paraguay and Bolivia, that are increasingly, almost totally dependent on Brazil today on trade, etc. But we don't look to people. Now you go to São Paulo, there are a bunch of immigrants, legal and illegal, from Bolivia coming. So the reality of the region is coming to us, and we have, this is, I think, one of the greatest challenges to Brazilian diplomacy going forward. And we have to have a non-prejudicial view. We have a very prejudiced and limited view of the region. You know, there are no programs of studying Argentina in Brazil, or the countries. We should, the universities there should, you know, because they are not moving. We are not moving. We have to live together. And Brazilian diplomacy is founded on this idea of having stable and good relations with neighbors. So this engagement is an enormous challenge for Brazil. And I think it's a very positive one. I'm sorry, your turn.
Oh, no problem. I'm Gladys Mitchell-Walthour, a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. I just wanted to know, and this either Richard or Juliana can answer, did you just do a cross-tabulation with race or color and opinions of the police? Because I know that black and browns are more victimized from the police than whites or other groups. And then the other question I had, which some people have already touched on concerning education, is if you have a question on affirmative action policies. That's a highly controversial topic right now in Brazil, and still even in the United States. So for this type of project, I think that would be useful.
Yeah, I did do a cross-tab on, if race and the question of police, and didn't find anything that was significant. I mean, I do think that in part one of the problems that we have is that very few of our respondents, I think about a little more than 100, self-identify as black. And so we have to have a very big difference. And so on the issue of social inequality, we saw a big enough difference that we got statistical significance. But we really do have to have very big differences with that small a sample size in that category. And so that might be why we didn't see a difference there. Yeah, and we didn't ask about affirmative action. I do think that it would be an interesting study to do something on racial views in Brazil, because as many of you know, it is a sensitive issue, and the way people self-identify is a very sensitive thing. And our question on race, the self-identification question, was not an open-ended question, and so it was black, mixed race, or white. And I think about close to maybe 50%, I don't remember the exact numbers, but close to 50% said they were of mixed race. If we'd been open-ended, that mixed race category would have had several different names, because people use a variety of different names to identify their racial identity. And so we didn't ask specifically about racial attitudes, but it would be certainly a very interesting study to do in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the last census, I think there were 130 different ways of saying that you are of African descent without saying it. It's quite amazing.
Right.
Well, the census is closed. The census is closed, so, but I mean, right now, I know in the 2007, there was a study, and now blacks and browns outnumber whites.
Right.
So those self-identifying as black, even though it's really small, that actually increased, and that impacted that percentage.
Right, so we have about 10% identifying as black, and and then close to maybe 50 identifying as mixed race. I mean, combining the two, you definitely get a majority that is not white.
And after much debate, you know that we have approved a law in Brazil, which is the what is it called? The statute of racial identity that, in principle, mandates that you identify yourself as white or black. And we say, really? Because most Brazilians are in between those two. There are different, and this thing, this is another fascinating and important issue in Brazil. Any other questions that you wanted to ask? Bruce, any comments? Okay. Well,
Absolutely, yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
thank you very much for allowing us for bringing this here. You know, this is your home, or your second home in Washington, if you wish. It's a pleasure and honor to work with you guys and to work with you. Thank you very much. Just one announcement. If you're interested in Brazil and U.S. For relations, and you should come here tomorrow morning, because we are going to have a conference, a 3-hour conference, and the U.S. Ambassador to Brasilia, former Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere, Ambassador Tom Shannon, will be here with us. So we invite you here, and if you are interested in knowing a little analysis of the elections results, you are welcome to be here at 3 p.m. on Monday, October 4th, and we will tell you everything in detail and explain everything, you know. So thank you very much for being with us. I would like to thank Renata Johnson and JC and Vidya for great working, organizing, helping us organizing this. And again, Richard, Juliana, thank you very much for sharing this with us. Good morning.